Hello and welcome back to podcast group number 3. I am Joshua Amponsah, back again with
David Ghansah.
Anais, Fernandez.
And Noah Jockett.
and we basically form what you know as podcast group 3. And today's topic is going to be critical race theory, which is essentially a body of work by civil rights scholars that aim to examine the intersection of race as Black people, or race in general, and law and how law is affected by race, as well as how society functions in tandem with race. So yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about today.
And we're also going to be comparing that to Afro-pessimism, and just seeing what different strategies each mode of thought takes.
And why is that? Why is Afro-pessimism the point at which we are making the what's the word? Like, why are we comparing it to Afro-pessimism? I believe your thought earlier was something along the lines of Afro-pessimism is more of like a, here's the problem and there's nothing we can do about it, versus critical race theory is working within a system that Afro-pessimism claims is like doomed to fail, whereas critical race theory is working within that system to improve the Black existence.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I feel for people who, how I would explain it to someone who has never ever heard, just heard it on the news, CLT, CRT compared to like Afro-pessimism, is like they're both two parallel lines in terms in which, like you said, they deal with the Black existence and how do Black people going forward sort of like act and exist.
Mhm.
And we have CLT, CRT, which focuses on working with the system, the institutions that exist, into creating this sort of liberating movement within Black people, while Afro-pessimism is sort of like a very individualistic approach in terms of, let's sort of separate Black people. We have to eliminate the system in which Black existence has had to exist in order to create a whole new world in which they are liberated and free. And so, like, I think what I've been wondering is, like, if going forward, if there's these two extremes with Afro-pessimism saying, like, we can't continue, like, we will never be free. What is the quote? Same shit, different day. With Afro-pessimism being like, no matter what improvements you think society has done, like, we will never like really improve, while CLT is like, even the littlest improvements are a win and better than tomorrow, and we need to impose those because that's better than nothing. Like, if they're so radically different, and like my biggest wonder is like, why? And
Well, I think an Afro-pessimist would say that someone who's decided to follow the critical race theory path would be subjecting themselves to the system that has decided to oppress them, instead of trying to conquer that system.
Yeah.
At least that was my take on it.
When I look at comparing a critical race theory to Afro-pessimism, I kind of categorize critical race theory as more of a intellectualized collective viewpoint on race wars, while Afro-pessimism is more reliant on the experiential. So when you're constantly, when you're aware of your Blackness, as Afro-pessimism is, it's essentially consistent of, when you're aware of your Blackness and your existence while also being aware of anti-Blackness, there's a sense of despair that comes within those pockets of happiness, that comes within those pockets of space. And because Afro-pessimism's framework is so emphatic on anti-Blackness, the ideology of the world not being, I think Fanon said, the only way for anti-Blackness to be removed from the world is for the world as a whole to be destroyed as we know it. So that just gives you insight on the ideal that Afro-pessimism imposes. It's kind of like social death. Like,
yeah, it's like definitely antithetical to critical race theory, as Anais was pointing out.
Exactly.
Yeah, and also earlier you said something I found interesting. Critical race theory as we see it in the news. I think that's a point we should definitely address because it has been in the news a lot lately. And why exactly has it been in the news?
I think race scares people. Talking about, because it brings history into the forefront, and there's always a specific aggressor when history is at the forefront. So because of that, there's a sense of unease, you know.
It makes people confront their own demons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Did you guys know that today is the anniversary of Micaiah Bryant's death?
I did not know that.
Yeah, so last year, today, Micaiah Bryant called the police. I don't really remember the details, but she called the police because she was like in this fight or something. And
I believe she was about to get jumped.
yeah, she was about to get jumped and all of that kind of stuff. And so, like, going back onto like why these words like CRT, CLT is all over the news is because like we see it every single day. These Black lives are taken away from us. And like we have to point out the aggressor, and as much as the media doesn't want to talk about it and wants to frame it in the light in which is socially acceptable, it's like it still has very implicit social actions to the people.
That's a good point that you make. I've recently been getting into acting and just filmmaking as a whole, and I was working on a project with one of my friends, and basically that calls for me as an actor to hold a gun. So obviously the gun is fake. It's a toy. It's like orange and blue. But immediately I said, "You want me to go outside at 2 a.m. in Columbus with a rolled up ski mask on my face, holding a gun in the same city where somebody got, I believe, I'm not sure of his name, but got shot because they mistake the footlong Subway sandwich for a gun."
Yeah.
I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
Get the green screen ready. So there's got to be another way. So that speaks a lot to understanding these different things. Tamir Rice, young man, but because of how he was perceived, although he was a child, like seen as a grown man, and even though he had a toy, he was treated like a grown man and murdered like a grown man that was doing something that he wasn't supposed to be doing. And the end of it all, gun was fake, wasn't any threat at all.
Even so, I feel like what we see about critical race theory in the news is definitely misguided. Like it's always from extreme right wing. Like, and I hate that I have to include Fox in this. But Fox is clearly extremely right wing.
Absolutely.
And I think it was like The Daily Show or something with Trevor Noah that I was watching. And they took like, they had like a compilation of how many times they said critical race theory in Fox News. And it was a lot. It's just I think it's a form of mobilizing people. You want people to vote for you, talk about a hot button issue that they have no clue about. You don't even have to talk accurately about the issue, but talk about it enough and have a strong enough opinion in either direction, liberal or conservative, you will mobilize the people.
Yeah, it's fear mongering.
Fear mongering.
Yeah,
definitely. And so I believe in the Daily Show they talked about how conservatives in the South were using it as a way to get their children to private schools instead of public schools, because the public schools are teaching critical race theory, and then you complain about it enough, they're like, oh, you have to give us money to attend other schools, private schools, if you don't want us to complain about our kids learning about critical race theory.
wow.
And I just found that so interesting. There's so many ways it's being, like, the whole hot topic aspect of it is being used as a vessel to like achieve other way more malevolent and like bad goals.
The fact that books are being banned and even burned because of this is just, it's amazing to me that it's still happening in this decade. Like, I mean, it's not as amazing now that we've gone through this class together, but when I first heard about it, I was like, I can't believe that literature is being destroyed because it's considered critical race theory, and then they're willing to ban books because it's teaching about that message. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
But it's like, on the other hand, like with the whole Afro-pessimist theories, like, and going down that rabbit hole of no sort of hope, same sort of insanity repeating upon itself as like the other sort of option in which Black people can choose their existence. It's sort of like leaves you into like either route. Black people are stuck in the same thing, and it's like, how is today's activism supposed to like empower these youth when the Black youth, when either path that they choose to go down, whether in support of CLT, CRT, or like what we're calling like the iconic media CLT, CRT that doesn't help them, and then the other thing, like telling your youth, hey, like this is gonna happen to you, and will always happen to you, and there's not really anything that you can do about it because any efforts are in vain. And so it's just like, where does that leave us? What's the middle ground between the two if they're on opposing ends but dealing with their same subject?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but for me, like, going back to our last class cries, but and the thoughts, this sort of like the will of a person being able to amplify them into something in which they can work towards liberation while at the same time being captive. That really struck to me. I don't know if you guys know, but I like interned at a grassroots organization, Ohio's Women's Alliance, which empowers Black women and Black youth. And so like a lot of the activism that I like, what my mentor sort of told me, and I don't know if I said this in the other podcast, but she was like, when you're in activism and when you're in this kind of line of work, you have to know that there's a very fine line in which you have to protect yourself as a human and give yourself that sort of like humanizing aspect that was given in like the Afro-pessimist sort of view, in which you don't kill yourself for your work, while at the same time still sort of trying to instill something in this institution that already exists. Because you can't go from you can't destroy an institution in one day, at least not one as big as here in the Americas. But what you can do is sort of work on yourself in this decolonial work and try to instill change in which you just being alive, that's on some days that's enough activism, and on other days where you have more energy, then more can be done, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And as we get towards the end of the podcast, I want to ask a question, perhaps to the point of the Afro-pessimist, depending on how you answer that question. But do you think that this is an ignorance issue, where if people knew what critical race theory actually stood for, the same people who are opposing it now, if they actually knew what it stood for, would they be in favor of it? I feel like for me, I come to the conclusion I come to is no. It's not an ignorance issue, unfortunately. The issue doesn't go away when people are suddenly educated, like, oh, this is what it actually stands for. No, the issue is more like, oh, these people are trying to make, like, some people have this perspective where it's these people are trying to make us pay for the wrongs that we didn't do, which becomes a whole other problem entirely, because that's like such an archaic way to view it, and where it's like, okay, it's not about you. It's not necessarily about you. It's about making things right, and it's about fixing the state of the world, not necessarily laying blame. And I think even if you do the work to explain that point, like the knowledge behind critical race theory, it's still that subjective portion about what is deserved versus undeserved that always sways people in the wrong direction, I feel like.
So I think that it's not, from my perspective, a yes or no answer. I think that there are people that are ignorant to what it is. And I think that if they were not, then I think that there would be some that would be understanding.
Oh, for sure. Some might be able to merit.
Now the ratio of people that would change their views, I think, is not like.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think you're right that it's not enough to be tangible. I don't think that's the word I'm looking for. It's the only word. Significant. That's, yeah. But I guess coming from like originally a like conservative Christian background and family, there are members of my family that I think would be more understanding if they weren't ignorant. Yeah. But then there are some people that I know from that background that I know wouldn't change their thoughts regardless, and that really disappoints me.
Yeah. Do you feel that they're cognizant to their ignorance? Like, is it a choice to be ignorant, or I mean, because information is out there.
Yeah.
You know, but if there's a resistance, then you're not gonna be open to it in the first place. So.
I think that this may sound a bit meta almost. I think that they are subconsciously choosing to be ignorant. Right. I think that like they are making a choice to stay ignorant, but it's not in their first frame of mind.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point to leave it off on. It's like, you think about your own family.
Yeah.
Think about your own family.
Check your ignorance.
How are they feeling?
Right. Cool. Well, that's the conclusion of podcast group number 3.
I gotta say, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I would say that was our best one, man.
Absolutely. How do I
just gotta cut it up a little bit. It's pretty good.